there's this content creator that I watch on TikTok, very popular in the family dynamic space, relationship space. And she posted a video earlier this week that grabbed my attention. And I'm going to guess like attention from a lot of people. Because in that video, what she was saying was that most people are not operating intentionally, meaning, like, in terms of their behavior, it's not like they are consciously choosing and have this malicious intent. They are simply just reacting. So, in other words, I interpret this to mean that they are unconscious. And from my experience, this is true, both in myself and, in other people. I don't think a lot of people perceive this about themselves. Like, I know, for example, when I was operating from an unconscious state, if you told me that, I would have totally rejected it. I would have said, no way, I'm fully conscious and fully aware of what I'm doing. But nevertheless, like, this post deeply resonated with me because the deeper I've gone into understanding trauma and how the nervous system organizes itself and attachment and identity and conditioning and all of those things, the harder it has become for me to view most human behavior through the lens of good people versus bad people. And I know that this conversation I'm about to have is incredibly nuanced. I know for some people, it might even sound like I'm trying to bypass harm. But I just simply want to articulate something that I have noticed because I think a lot of online healing spaces sometimes replace one form of black and white thinking with another. Now, before I even learned abuse language, before I even knew words like narcissism and coercive control and like what toxic relationships looked like, I was in a relationship that confused the fuck out of me. Like, I just could not understand the motivation behind his behavior. Like, for me, it always felt like extremes. It was hot and cold, it was up and down. And one day I was good and one day I was bad. And I spent so much fucking time trying to analyze what would motivate this person to behave that way because it was so different than how I would have behaved. Now, from my current perspective, I can recognize now that my need to understand them was my own safety seeking mechanism. But while I was in it, I never actually experienced the other person as like consciously evil or like trying to destroy me in some way. What I did experience was someone who was operating from their unresolved pain, that someone who perceived the world through a lot of fear, and someone who used control tactics to try to manage that fear. Um, I saw his attachment patterns, I saw his reactivity, and basically I saw his unconsciousness, right? From my experience, everything about his behavior was rooted in survival. Now, I didn't have nervous system language back then, but intuitively I understood that this person was simply operating from a state where they were protecting themselves, right? This person was reenacting all of their unresolved wounding. And honestly, having that understanding was part of the reason why I stayed, because when I understood their behavior as unconscious survival, like, I just waited. I waited and I hoped and I accommodated and I thought that, because I had that awareness and they didn't, I could help guide them. I could help change things. Because I could see things that he didn't see because I had already met those parts of myself. And I think many people stay in, relationships that don't actually benefit them because they can see the humanity underneath the behavior. As a side note, what I didn't see in myself because I was so focused on him and his behavior were my own survival adaptations operating too, right? On the surface, I thought I was being compassionate and emotionally intelligent and empathetic and understanding. But underneath that, I can now see that my nervous system was still organizing around him, right? Trying to prove my worth and my value by understanding him, by helping him, by accommodating, by being the person that was able to hold complexity, by being the person who could love him deeply enough, who could see the humanity underneath his behavior and not abandon someone, right? And not abandon him. And I think that's really important for me to acknowledge, because even though I had all of that self-awareness, even in my tendency to humanize behavior that was harmful, I was not operating from pure consciousness. I was also operating from a state of survival, right? It was my own conditioning. It was my own attachment patterns, my own identity organization. And I think that this is where these conversations become much more nuanced, because now we're not talking about good people versus bad people. We're talking about unconscious systems interacting with unconscious systems. One person is trying to protect themselves through control. Another person is trying to protect themselves through over empathizing, over understanding. One person is organizing themselves around shame avoidance. The other person is organizing themselves around proving their value through empathy and understanding. And what's so interesting is both people believe that they are reacting to reality without fully seeing the nervous system patterns that are driving their behavior. After I left that relationship, I entered the online space of abuse and abuse discourse and abuse education. And then suddenly, all of my experiences were being reframed differently, right? Instead of recognizing the unconscious patterns, now the narratives were, well, they know exactly what they're doing. You know, everything they do is calculated. They're intentionally manipulative. They do this to control you. It's all about power and control. These, narcissistic people strategically manipulate you, and they are consciously choosing to harm you. And because I had not yet learned to trust my own experiences and my own perspectives, I fucking bought right into it. Right. I joined the band. I jumped on that bandwagon. I joined it. I made a fucking banner and I was right along with it. And I started to create content in the same manner, where this behavior was intentional and it was calculated. And honestly, from my current perspective, it slid me backwards. It slid me backwards to a point where now I was completely rejecting someone's humanity. And I can even remember there were a couple times where other people tried to point that out to me. I remember one guy specifically. Now he was not very nice, but he started trolling me a little bit, and then he eventually stitched one of my videos and he called me a communal narcissist and self-righteous narcissist. Um and it fucking hit. It stung. I was not happy about that. But at the same time, I completely rejected it and I justified myself. I said so many times, I'm just speaking about behavior, abuse is behavior. And I'm talking about behavior. I'm not talking about the person. And so because I was talking about behavior and I wasn't actually attacking the person, I believed that I was helping. I believed that I was helping people by labeling behavior. And online right now, I see so many creators that are focused on behavior. Abuse is behavior after all. And I understand why these behavior-based frameworks exist, because for many people, these frameworks create clarity. They give them a sense of validation. In some cases, they give you permission to leave. They give you an opportunity to recognize, oh, wait, no, this isn't healthy and I'm allowed to leave. And it's a way I think, for a lot of victims to stop minimizing the behavior that they're experiencing. But like I said, for me personally, it was like I felt myself move backwards from one polarity of over-humanizing harmful behavior to the exact opposite of dehumanizing human behavior altogether. And the truth is, neither one of those felt good to me. And again, the deeper that I got into understanding the nervous system, the more I see how automatic human beings actually are, how much of our behavior is driven by one, our conditioning, um, two, fear, three, identity protection, attachment survival, shame avoidance, like all of it is just unconscious, automatic behavior. And I'm not saying this to erase impact. Impact still exists, but it does change how I understand humanity. I think in a lot of healing spaces, we're often taught, and like I have videos that say this too, black and white thinking is something that, people with cluster B personality do, like narcissistic people do, BPD people do. But if I'm being honest, I see most people operating from black and white thinking. Just it shows up in just different ways. And the more that I dig into the nervous system and unconscious patterns, the more that I'm starting to recognize how black and white thinking itself, we recognize black and white thinking as a cognitive distortion, but black and white thinking itself is a unconscious protection mechanism because complexity is really difficult for the nervous system to hold. Nuance destabilizes certainty, and it's certainty that regulates people. And I think this is part of the reason why all of these nuanced conversations feel threatening. Like all of my current content feels very threatening to people because it collapses certainty, and the ego loves and needs and feeds on certainty. This is why labels are so powerful. This is why categorizing and organizing people has become mainstream, because the ego loves certainty. It loves knowing precisely what something is so that it can keep itself safe. The mind does that by simplifying things, by condensing things, by putting things into boxes, good or evil, victim, abuser, conscious, toxic, safe, unsafe, even safe, unsafe. Certainty creates temporary nervous system relief. So if I go back to the beginning where I was talking about, confusion in my relationship, the confusion existed because my ego was trying to categorize him. Which one is he? Is he safe or is he unsafe? Is he good or is he bad? And that is the reason why I stayed for so long. My nervous system was organizing around him and trying to figure him out, not being able to understand and recognize that he was both. He was both. We are always both. Humans are many things. We're layered and we're multifaceted, and sometimes we're good and sometimes we're bad, and sometimes we react and sometimes we choose. And when the nervous system can't hold that duality, that polarity, it panics. And I think this is important for people to recognize, because once we can stop seeing black and white thinking as something only like unhealthy or unsafe or toxic people do, we can begin to recognize it as a deeply human adaptation to fear and instability and pain and unresolved unconsciousness. So what I see now is not good people versus bad people. Like, what I see are a bunch of externally oriented nervous systems organizing around safety in distorted ways. I see people trying to protect their identities. I see people trying to avoid shame or to maintain control or to avoid rejection or abandonment. I see nervous systems that feel powerless. I see nervous systems that feel unworthy. I see people trying to regulate themselves through other people. They're trying to get safety through control and validation and attention and reassurance and agreement or proximity. So, yeah, like a lot of those strategies could become incredibly painful and destructive. And I do see like people hurting each other every day this way, but I don't perceive it as people consciously sitting there calculated, making intentions, trying to harm somebody. I experience this behavior as largely unconscious, meaning they're simply reacting automatically from conditioning that they do not fully see. And that includes all of us in many ways. Like that was me for a long time. Even in my past relationships, I can see how my nervous system was organizing around safety too. I wasn't doing it through control, but I was doing it through over functioning. I was doing it through over understanding and over accommodating and all of those things, trying to prove my worth through staying and helping and loving and understanding somebody else's pain. So now when I look at relationships, it's so interesting because I don't see one bad person hurting a good person. I just see unconscious patterns interacting with each other. One person is trying to protect through control and another is trying to protect through self-abandonment. One person is protecting through emotional shutdown and the other person is protecting through hyper-attunement. And both people believe that they are reacting to reality without fully seeing the unconscious patterns beneath, operating underneath. And that perspective has changed everything for me because it helps me no longer organize my understanding of relationships around blame, around punishment, and I think more specifically, moral superiority. I find that I'm more interested in understanding like what creates the patterns, how humans, learn to organize around safety, how trauma responses interact relationally. Once I started seeing human behavior through the lens of nervous system organization instead of morality, humans started to make a lot more sense to me. So, like I said in the beginning, I know a lot of people are going to hear this and they're going to think, so you're saying that it's okay, like harmful behavior is okay. No, that's not what I'm saying. And honestly, if that is immediately what you jump to, like that reaction points back exactly to what I've been talking about black and white thinking. For many people, nuance itself feels threatening. Because if we don't categorize behavior as evil or abusive or toxic or narcissistic, then people who have experienced that behavior feel like they're not allowed to recognize the harm that they experienced. And that's not what I'm saying at all. I absolutely experienced certain relationship dynamics as harmful. There was a point of time in my life where certain behavior I experienced as abusive. But what's more interesting to me now in the state that I'm currently in is that when I experienced them as harmful, it was because my nervous system was organized around them. My nervous system needed their validation, their reassurance, their approval, their emotional regulation, their awareness, their consistency. My nervous system wanted them to change. And that is when their behavior had power over me because my internal state was organized around them and their behavior. But something really powerful happened when I shifted into self-reference. When I stopped organizing my identity, my worth, my emotional stability, my sense of safety around another person, I also stopped needing to collapse people into categories, into villains, into evil, into intentional and abusive in order to remain connected to myself. And honestly, I know this is going to sound strange for some people, but I stopped needing to remove myself from these types of people. Like on a lot of online discourse, no contact. No contact is so fucking popular right now. Set a boundary and protect my peace. Once I stopped organizing around other people, the dynamic shifted. The relationship dynamics I experienced shifted. One of two things happened. Either the other person learned to organize around themselves and to meet me differently, or two, they removed themselves completely from my experience because they could no longer regulate through my self-abandonment. And I think this distinction feels huge because a lot of healing discourse still frames empowerment as cutting people off and going no contact and removing yourself and, eliminating toxic people. I even hear people all the time that says, once you're healed, you no longer let these people have access to you. And there was a time where I thought that too, but that's not what I experience from my current perspective. I actually don't need to cut anybody off. Other people's behavior simply does not impact me. And I'm not saying that it's not necessary. Sometimes it is, but I think this shows a deeper level of healing where your internal orientation changes so profoundly that the relationship dynamic itself reorganizes naturally. And it's not done through control or manipulation or ultimatums or by proving that somebody else is a villain. It's because I'm no longer unconsciously participating in the pattern. And this is an entirely different conversation than, they're bad. I need to cut them off because they're toxic. The conversation shifts to, what am I organizing around? What am I doing that is giving this dynamic power over me? How am I participating in this unconsciously? And what changes when I stop regulating myself through another person? These types of questions are far more transformative to me than simply labeling other people and their behavior. Because I think many people move from minimizing harmful behavior directly into demonizing human beings. And both of them are distortions. One removes discernment, the other removes humanity. And I think this deeper level of healing actually asks us to hold something much more complex than either or. This conversation goes far beyond relationships. I think this conversation is about consciousness itself, about how humans simplify reality into polarity because polarity feels safer than complexity. But as I've said, like the deeper I go into understanding the nervous system and spirituality and human behavior, the less interested I become in assigning people fixed identities. And the more interested I become in understanding the systems operating underneath behavior itself, because behavior is the product. Behavior is the end. It's the last step. There's all of these things happening before we get to behavior. And if we're not addressing what lies under the behavior, nothing changes. Recognizing that behavior is safety seeking, even controlling behavior, even manipulative behavior, even, harmful behavior, it doesn't excuse the harm. It doesn't bypass the pain you're experienced. It's simply holding truth. Because I think reducing human beings to good or evil, victim or abuser, narcissist or empath, it's limiting. It's binary, and it doesn't lead to deeper consciousness and deeper awareness and deeper expansion. I think it just often creates new identities for the nervous system to organize around. It creates new identities for the ego to organize around.